Actually, my wife, well, before we were married, she was clipping mine, but I'm a little anal about how certain things are. My hair is one of them.
Certain things.
Hey,
I think you're particular about everything in your life, Derek.
what's up?
I think you're particular about everything in your life.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. We'll get us recording here.
Recording started.
All righty, well, today in class we have two gentlemen going to introduce themselves in just a second from IFCA, and then one of their, I guess, kind of partnering agency, Southeast Extension. And so why don't you guys introduce yourself, and they're going to share for a few minutes. We had a really good chat after lunch about some church planting ideas, especially for your practicum. They've got a lot of connections with churches that do leadership development, internships, that sort of thing across not just church planting, but pastoral youth. I mean, they kind of do an all-encompassing thing, and they're connected with a lot of churches. Piedmont has been connected with you folks for decades, and so have a good relationship with IFCA. So, Dr. Lofquist,
Yes.
perhaps?
Yes.
And you are the president of IFCA.
Yes.
And then Reverend Daniel, and he is with the Southeast Church Extension, and basically kind of officially, unofficially work for IFCA, I guess, kind of how it works. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves. Okay. And to these guys, I told them that we were talking about the phases of church planting, kind of introducing that and talking through it. And so I think Pastor Davis want to talk a little bit about that. So gentlemen, go ahead.
I'll get started, and then I'll turn it over to Dan. Once again, my name's Les Lofquist. I oversee IFCA International, which is a fellowship of churches and pastors, and we have church planters, we have military chaplains, we have Bible colleges, presidents of different mission agencies. We have got a lot of different people involved. But I live up in Michigan. Our guy, who is down in the Atlantic Southeast area, is Dan Nave, who's next to me. Both of us are experienced in church planting. I was a church planter in Utah among the Mormons, and that was hard going, and so I have a lot of experience in places where it's really difficult, and with people who don't want you there. So that's my background. That was my first ministry after I was done with my education. Then I went into, I started teaching at a Bible college, and I went into being a senior pastor of a church and teaching part-time in seminary before I was called to this position 15 years ago. We have different agencies who are planting churches here in the U.S., and we're in 26 countries around the world. But we're focused on North America today, and I brought along with me today Dan Nave. Dan lives in Newport, Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, and he's involved in church planting here in North America as well. But I thought Dan, since his connection is more close with you and Piedmont, I live in Michigan, and I get down here once every year or two, whereas Dan can make it over here, a couple times each semester. So he's also, the kinds of church plants that he's talking about and church extension is right here in this region of the United States. So I thought this would really be good. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and Dan's got some things he wants to share about church planting.
Thank you. My name's Dan Nave. I'm the director of Southeast Church Extension, which is a church service agency. We are members of the IFCA, and my field of ministry is 8 states in the Southeast. If you look at a map, everything except Florida. We have a different agency that works in Florida. And my role is to extend ministry to churches and pastors and schools, whomever we can work with for the cause of Christ. Certainly church planting is primary to us. And everything that we do, we want that to kind of either stem from church planting or feed into church planting. One of the things that we do, and we're attempting to establish what I've done in previous ministries, is internships, summer internships especially, to give you opportunities, or give the student opportunities, to do a variety of church ministry. When I was pastoring in 2 previous churches over the last 22 years, we didn't keep anything from interns. The interns were exposed to everything, unless it was something that would be embarrassing to someone else, say in a counseling situation. Everything else was on the table. If it was a particularly difficult leadership meeting, I didn't keep the interns away from it. Because my philosophy was, if they can't handle a board meeting at this church, what's going to happen when they go out to pastor their own church and run into similar problems? So we wanted to expose the good and sometimes the difficult in church ministry. In the church planting side, which is where I really want to speak with y'all today about, we have a specific strategy, and Dustin, you've shared with me that you're talking about, bullet points or necessary steps in the development of the church, and it's probably all very similar. I have mine that incorporates the name of our mission agency, Southeast Church Extension, and so I use the word scenes. When a church planter would come work with us, then we would expect him and or her to be involved in each of these phases of a church ministry, with the goal that at the end it be a healthy church planting church. We don't believe that it's just enough, as admirable as it is to start churches, we don't believe that it's enough to just start a church, but rather to start a church that has built into its DNA starting churches. And so to accomplish that, we have these 6 elements of the process. The first one is survey, very preliminary, sometimes very embryonic in the course of starting a church. Perhaps a student would come to me and say, I have loved ones in an area of this particular state. I know there's not a good Bible preaching church there. I would love to go start a church. Is there a way that we can accomplish that? And so then we would offer services that we have and counsel, come alongside them to help them do that. It might be a family in an area. A few years ago we had a family in northern Ohio who came to us, and they had been involved in an IFCA church in Michigan that had a strong expository ministry, and in their situation where they were, there were none. When we did our survey and discovered what churches were available and what was there, we actually had a meeting. We put an ad in the paper, just a kind of an exploratory meeting. And one of the people who showed up at that meeting was a former assistant pastor at a church in that community. And at the end of our meeting, he said to us, I'm such and so, I used to be the assistant pastor at such and such church. And he said there's 66 churches in this county, and I don't know of another church that focuses on expositional Bible teaching. I am so glad you're here. Yeah, and this was in a fairly populated area in northwest Ohio. So we go into communities, and we internships would involve training the student or the potential candidate to do these things. But we look at, when we talk about survey, we're talking about research, demography. It's so easy today with what's available to us online. In the old days, we had to actually go into a community. Now, there's still a place for that, but it's not the preliminary step like it used to be. We started a church in a suburb of Louisville a few years ago. My wife and I drove down to Louisville, to these bedroom communities, and we spent 2 days driving in our car, with me driving and my wife taking notes, and just interviewing people in the community, going to Home Depot and asking at the construction counter, where are they building houses? Where are people moving? Those kinds of things. That doesn't have to happen up front as much now, because you've got a laptop at home. You can do a lot of that there. Yeah. Survey includes that. determining possible needs and viability for a church in that community. You know, we have a lot of areas in our country that have real need for Bible-believing churches. And there are a few areas in the country where the need isn't as great. I'm not going to say there's no need, but the need isn't as great. Les is from Grand Rapids. There's not a lot of church planting as such happening in Grand Rapids proper because there's such a large number of churches there already. And again, that's not to say there's not a need for church planting, but it's not as pronounced as it might be in the county that I live in, East Tennessee. You know, we think in the mountains, there's a church at the bottom of every holler, and that may be true. But there, a recent survey that the Southern Baptist Convention took in our county discovered that in the demographic of 18 to 34, only 3% of the population of our county profess Christ as their Savior. And so even there, in the mountains, there are needs. So we look at those things, and that's the survey element. The second step then is coalition. And by coalition, what we mean is the building of alliances with other people, other churches, networking with churches. There may be a larger church 50 miles from there that can fund a new church, or they may have leadership who are driving 30 minutes. The most recent church I pastored in Indiana, we had about a 50-mile radius from our little community where people were driving to attend our church. In some communities, it's even more than that. Les and I have a mutual friend in Michigan who used to be a professor at Grand Rapids School of the Bible and Music, who was pastoring a large church of about 600 people. They discovered that 15 miles away in another town, there was no Bible-believing church. So they created a strategy. Let's take 100 people from our church. Let's ask for 100 volunteers to go to this other community and start a new church. We will fund it for a year. We will use one of our assistant pastors as the church planter in this new church, which they did. So on the first Sunday, the new church had 100 people. The planting church had 500 instead of 600. A year later, the baby church had grown to 150, and the sending church was back up to 600 again. And so, that coalition is important. Networking is really important because there are people who have tools and skills that can help you with a church plant. There might be, Les and I have another mutual friend in Utah who started a church several years ago, and another church in another community sent 3 families to help them for a year. They did nursery. They did music, things like that. To help, it gave them more people, but then it also gave them ministry tools to use to reach out in their community. They had a little storefront church. They bought an old gas station, and they only had half of it, and they used that for their new meeting place. And so having a coalition of other churches that can help is an important thing. And I have a personal strategy for that we teach to the interns about how to build that we call parent churches, partner churches, and promise churches. The promise church idea is very interesting because not every church can afford, smaller churches can't necessarily afford a lot of money, but any smaller church, no matter how large or how small, can promise. They can make some promises to the new church plant. They can promise to pray. They can promise to promote that work. They can promise to do a love offering once a year. There are a number of things that promise churches can do. So the coalition is very important. Once you've done survey, determined that this is a viable idea, and then you've begun to build your coalition, then the E in the word scenes is engagement. And that's where you begin recruiting leadership. You begin building a team. You might even initiate public ministry in the form of a Bible class or a Bible study. You can see how these may overlap a little bit. Once you're beginning your coalition, you may find there's, when you've done survey, you may have discovered there's 2 families in this town that are interested in a Bible study. So you may start doing a Tuesday night Bible study with them before you really have your church up and running. But so they do overlap. But engaging in the ministry, this is where you would begin praying if you already don't have someone to lead the work. Let's say this is a planting church who wants to start a new church in another community. This is where then they really get serious about finding a church planter. Coming to Piedmont International University and finding a student who's ready to graduate and go plant a church, or recruiting an elder from their church or a deacon from their church. It can happen in a number of ways, but you want to create leadership. You will want to build a team, an accountability team. And that may be a number of pastors or lay people from a variety of churches who help you give oversight until the church is mature enough to have its own. So that's engagement. And then eventually to engage in public ministry, however that looks. And for every church, it's going to look different. Then the N in scenes is nourishment. This is the phase where the church develops its organization. You begin to codify documents, policies, build various ministry teams in the church. The church begins to mature. And the maturity phase is an important thing that can really take a long time. I started a church in Indiana in 2004. It was 2012 before I had my first elder. Because I groomed guys throughout those years, and for one reason or another, they would all move away. They would get a job change. About the time we'd be ready to place them as elder, their job would transfer them to another place. And so it took us a long time to actually establish an elder. And I dragged my feet in church planting, in establishing leadership. Because you can do a great deal of damage to a church if you place people in a role of leadership who aren't ready for that. And so I would rather be slow at that, especially if I have an accountability team from other churches or wherever that are helping me. Then I want to go very slowly in placing elders and deacons in those important roles to make sure that they're ready for that. Also in the nourishment stage, that's where we begin to work on a strategy for starting another church. I mentioned earlier about building into the church's DNA that it would be a church planting church. I knew some church planters when I was pastoring in Michigan. They were denominational guys, and they started a church in our community, and their denomination required them to sign a document that they wouldn't purchase property or build a building until they had started the second church. I thought that was really interesting, because building a church planting mindset into the new church was very important to that denomination.
Yeah.
And they had a nice building, it was actually a theater. They had a five venue theater that they rented. So they had to get out, they had to be out because there was a 12:30 matinee every Sunday. So they had to get out every Sunday. So they had a whole team of people, there was a couple hundred people by this time, moving things in and moving things out. But they had agreed that they wouldn't build a church building until they had started church number 2. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Not necessarily saying that's always the right thing to do, but it was very intriguing to me to build that philosophy into the church. And so at the nourishment stage, that's where we begin to help people see the importance of reaching out at that level. Hopefully you've been building the Great Commission into their lives all along, but now you're really putting feet to it. And let's find another place where we can start another church. So that's the end. The second E is exit strategy. I know of churches that have been with a church planting agency for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. And I wonder, why is that? And so at the
You're talking here in the U.S.
I'm
North
talking
America.
here in the U.S.
I know some like that too.
Yeah. And when we started our church in Indiana, it was a very unique situation. But even before we brought on missionaries, we established a strategy for getting the church to full pastoral support, which a lot of mission churches don't do. They rely on their church planters' missionary support to, continue on. And to be truthful with you, a lot of those churches that are still mission plant churches status in 10 or 15 years, the reason is because they can't afford a pastor. And so the second year of our ministry, we implemented a strategy to get that church to full support status of pastor. Now, I was the pastor. That sounds very pragmatic. It wasn't, because I wanted that church to understand the importance of supporting their pastor. Not every church can do that. We understand that. But this church could. We had to create the want to for them. And so the strategy that we created was every 3 months they would look at their finances, and if they could afford to take on another portion of pastoral salary, they did. And it took us 42 months. I started out at 50% support, and in 42 months we were at 100% support. Let me rephrase that. I started out at 100% support when we started this church. The church was giving me 50% of my support, and I had the other 50 coming from other areas. So in 42 months, every quarter, the church took a little larger bite of my total support, and my other sources for support were reduced. So it wasn't an increase in salary necessarily in that 42 months, but it was kind of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that the church then was fully supporting us. That really worked to the good, I believe, of the cause of Christ, because then when we believed it was time for God to move us on into Southeast Church Extension and directing this ministry, that church could afford to give salary to, actually it was one of my interns that we trained, and I left. We thought he would be leaving to go pastor or start a church, and instead I left and he stayed and pastored that one. So it was really a neat situation. So exit strategy for church plants is important, and you need to have that very early in the process. Here, and it may, that needs to be a very liquid and flexible strategy, but it needs to be there. You may need to revise it as you go along, but you need to have an exit strategy. So, okay, here are some goals that we want to be looking toward, so that this church is no longer a mission-supported church. It is now fully autonomous and self-supporting. And then the S in the word scenes is stability. And so that obviously needs to happen before you can implement your exit strategy. You have the exit strategy, and that may include a number of bullet points in implementation to get you to stability. This is where a church can function without outside help. You have established leadership. You have, if you're of that mind, you have elders, or you have deacons, or you have whatever structure you've devised. You have those people in place. At the stability phase, that's where then you're released from mission status, and there's a graduation ceremony or whatever you would do, and that's when the church, I believe a church isn't really stable until it's ready to participate in the starting of a new church. So that whole DNA thing of building into the church's DNA a mind for church planting, this is then, a church is stable when they can begin making that plan to start a new church. So that's what the scenes of church planting with Southeast Church Extension is, and how that works. And you can see that's a multi-year thing. But I believe that we need to be goal-oriented as church planters and pastors, and at least have a strategy for doing it. You may revise it as you go along the way, but at least have a starting point.
Yeah.
Okay?
I appreciate you sharing, and the reason I wrote, because as you were saying things, they really fit with how we outlined, and even we'll go a little bit further, but in envisioning, you're surveying, we talk about researching, you're dreaming of it, you're thinking of location, you're thinking of all kinds of things. In the coalition part, we're talking about preparing, and part of that preparation is partnering, networking, and it's also, in that preparation, you're making disciples from the harvest. You're, starting to get things. You're kind of even still assessing who you are, and then the launch. You're engaging. You're either engaging through the public worship, or you're engaging the community through the ministries. Nourishment is establishing. You're establishing the church body and growing, and then the exit strategy and the stability really kind of fit with everything, but going into the repeat section, because you just go back to envisioning, but it may look different. Now your exit strategy is you're now the guy who is being sent from your church to go and start the whole envisioning and go through.
Or that church is finding someone in the church or
Right.
a Piedmont student that they're going to help launch a new church.
And so your as you would say, scenes really evolve through your church life.
Yes.
Because you won't do the same exact survey, coalition, engagement part as you did the very first time, because you have a different context, different person, maybe even a different model or plant approach. What if you plan a church that has a weekly gathering, several hundred, but then you actually started a house church network out of that? Everything's going to look different. It's still going to follow the same steps in a lot of sense. But how you go through your surveying, your partnering, it evolves and changes, which is that kind of fluidity you talked about. So I appreciate you sharing. That was very good. Well, let's thank these gentlemen for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I've got you want to go by Dan? Is that fine,
Yeah.
Dan? I've got his info, and I'll post it in Blackboard so that you guys can email him if you would like
Yeah, I'll
to
get
ask
this
more
to you.
questions. Yeah,
Thank you.
do that as well. So
He's
for our
speaking in
online
chapel
students.
tomorrow on this.
Okay,
on
so
Yeah,
you'll
I'll
be
be
in chapel.
talking in chapel tomorrow about Southeast Church Extension and really what we do, the whole kind of a la carte menu of what
Good.
Southeast Church Extension offers in bringing our tagline for our agency is bringing ministry to pastors and churches.
Very
And
nice.
so what we can offer to guys like you.
Very good.
You want to tell them about Matt? You want to tell them about our church plant?
Oh, International Bridge Church.
It's going to be a highly liberal
Yeah.
church.
He's one of
Yeah.
our elders.
Yeah.
They're not
Women
ready to
pastors.
graduate.
Yeah, that's
We've only been in this for 3 months.
We've got the fourth month is when you retool.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
guys.
guys.
Take
Appreciate
Good to
it.
meet y'all.
Yeah, good.
Take care.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow. Alrighty. Well, I thought that was an impromptu good happenstance.
Finally.
Wow.
Totally joking.
And that's being recorded.
I,
But no,
I
I
enjoyed that. I was being
Yeah.
sarcastic.
Yeah, it was actually really fitting. I met with him after I had lunch with you, Derek, and Dr. Trakian wanted me just to meet these guys. I've heard of these two gentlemen, I've not met them yet, and so he wanted me to meet, and we talk about a lot of the same ideas, and what he and me and Dan talked a lot about at lunch was just really the practicum part of the program, and they have a lot of really good ideas about taking an internship into more of a residency. You kind of start as doing a practicum for a degree, but then it turns into continuing their internship to be sent or to, as he said, even take over some. And they've got they have churches all over the nation. They're connected with about around 2,000 or so, and they're non-denominational. And so they've got Baptist, Bible, some more community-based church, different kinds of churches involved in their group, and so.
I feel like this is the first time I've ever heard anything like that before. It was amazing.
Yeah,
Eye-opening.
You're funny. It's almost like I almost don't want to do the lecture part this week because he kind of stole my thunder. I'm kidding. All right, well let's jump to stage 2 of today. Let me retool our screen. Go ahead and get the Luke journal out. We're going to do Luke in just a second, and I was hoping to have time to go ahead and just do the lecture part for today, but we'll see if we have time for that. How do I exit this? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. All right, go ahead and get out your Luke journal.
21, right?
Where's my... There we go. All right, Kelly, you still hanging out with us?
Are you alive, Kelly? Oh, there she is.
Kelly didn't lift the building. No, she's there. All right, so let's go ahead and do our. Oh, I turned your mic off. How did I do that?
IDK.
I don't think I turned it off, did I? Let me. Can you speak now, Kelly? There's an X. There shouldn't be.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
we hear you now. Yeah.
That's weird. I can talk to you, but there's a red X over the microphone button. Like, not the button, but down below next to my name, there's a red X over it.
Well, that's just.
And usually, when there's red X, it means I don't have my permission.
Oh no, that's a red X that Derek asked to put beside your name because he doesn't want you to feel like you're the best student in the class.
Would be me.
Oh, no, that was mine.
So, like, I put the mouse over top of it, and it says mic permission off, is what it says.
Huh. Well,
There's a good reason for that too.
you're talking.
Oh,
Okay.
mean.